She was mocked in front of Chicago's most powerful people, wearing a dress someone else destroyed on purpose. But the man who watched from the shadows, he remembered her, and he never forgot a debt. If this story grips you from the first scene, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's get into it. The dress was wrong from the moment Evelyn Hart put it on. She knew it the second her fingers touched the fabric. A raw silk in pale champagne, borrowed from the zippered garment bag her cousin Vanessa had sent over 2 days before the gala with a handwritten note that said, "Wear this. Trust me, you'll thank me later." Evelyn had run her thumb along the seam at the waist and felt it immediately. The tension was off. Whoever had sewn this, and someone had resewn it, she was certain of that, had used the wrong thread weight on the left side panel. A seamstress for 11 years, since she was 19 years old and apprenticing under her father's oldest friend in the back of a shop on Halsted Street, Evelyn knew what correct stitching felt like the way a musician knew a note played flat. Her fingers didn't lie to her, but she told herself she was being paranoid. She told herself that a lot. The night of the Wintercrest Gala arrived cold and mean, the way January in Chicago always did. Not the romantic, cinematic kind of cold, but the kind that crawled under your collar before you'd even reached the sidewalk and made your eyes water before you wanted them to. Evelyn stood in front of the narrow bathroom mirror in her apartment above the tailoring shop, trying to put her hair up and mostly failing, watching her reflection with the kind of detached dissatisfaction she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. She was 30 years old and she looked it. Not badly. Her face was clear, her eyes were a deep, serious brown, her features composed in a way that some people called pretty and most people simply overlooked. She was the kind of woman who disappeared in rooms. She had spent years carefully arranging that disappearance, treating it like a survival strategy, which, in most of the places she'd been, it was. The invitation had come through Vanessa 3 weeks ago. Her cousin had phoned on a Tuesday evening while Evelyn was letting out the seams on a suit jacket for an alderman's aide and had spent 6 minutes explaining why attending the Wintercrest Gala would be good for business. The Wintercrest was the event of Chicago's social calendar. Not the loudest, not the most photographed, but the one where the real money moved, where contracts were implied over champagne flutes, and favorable introductions were worth more than any advertisement Evelyn could afford. Vanessa had painted it all very reasonably. She'd said she wanted to help. She'd said it was time Evelyn's work got seen by people who could actually pay for it. She'd said it as though she were doing Evelyn a favor, which should have been warning enough, because Vanessa Crowley had never done anyone a favor that didn't cost them something. But Evelyn's father's heating unit had broken down 2 weeks before the call, and the repair estimate was sitting on her kitchen counter like an accusation, and she was already 3 months behind on the shop lease, so she'd said yes. She'd said yes and tried to mean it. Now she stood in the dress that felt wrong and painted her lips a color she almost never wore and told herself it would be fine. She was going to find clients. She was going to be professional and quiet and invisible in all the right ways. And she would leave early before the drinking got sloppy and the cruelties came out. She'd done it before at events like this, moving along the edges of rooms, listening without being heard, cataloging faces and names for follow-up. She could do this. The car Vanessa sent arrived at 7:45. The driver didn't speak. Evelyn sat in the back with her hands folded in her lap and watched the city move past the window, the familiar architecture of downtown Chicago lit up against a sky that held no stars, the streets already glazed with a thin shine of freezing rain. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass and breathed slowly. The Castellan Hotel stood on Michigan Avenue like a statement. It was the old money kind of grand, not flashy, not glass and steel modern, but dark stone and iron railings and revolving brass doors that had been turning since 1921. The kind of building that made you feel your own insignificance before you'd crossed the threshold. Evelyn paid the driver's tip, pulled her coat tighter, and walked in. Vanessa was already in the lobby, and she was radiant. That was the only word for it. Vanessa Crowley at 34 was the kind of beautiful that cost money to maintain. The perfect blowout, the flawless skin, the midnight blue gown that Evelyn recognized immediately as couture, probably imported. She was laughing with 2 women whose names Evelyn didn't know, laughing the way she always did in public, with her whole body, like she was performing rather than feeling. She turned when she heard Evelyn's heels on the marble, and her smile shifted, just barely, just enough for someone paying attention to notice. Evie. She opened her arms. You made it. Evelyn let herself be embraced. Vanessa smelled like something expensive. You look beautiful, Evelyn said, because it was true. And you look... Vanessa held her at arm's length and studied her with wide, bright eyes. And for just a fraction of a second, something moved across her face that Evelyn couldn't name. Perfect. That color is so you. The two women behind Vanessa smiled. They introduced themselves as Petra and Margot. And they were the kind of women who wore their wealth the way Evelyn wore thread. Naturally, without thinking, in every gesture and syllable. They looked at Evelyn the way people at events like this sometimes did. A quick scan that registered price point and positioning and filed her under inconsequential in the same motion. Evelyn was used to it. She smiled and nodded and followed them into the ballroom. The Castellans' grand ballroom was devastating in the way only very old, very expensive rooms could be. Two-story ceilings hung with tiered chandeliers. The floor was pale marble that reflected everything above it like a lake's surface. Round tables with white linens and towering floral arrangements. At the far end, a string quartet played something that felt like it was designed to make you feel vaguely inadequate for existing. Evelyn took a glass of champagne from a passing tray, drank half of it faster than she meant to, and began to walk the edges. For the first hour, she was fine. She found two women who ran a charitable foundation and spent 15 minutes talking about custom evening wear. She exchanged cards with a woman named Delphine, who managed wardrobe for a local theater company. She smiled. She listened. She was careful. She watched the room from the corner she occupied and noted who was talking to whom and what kind of conversations were happening under the surface of the polished ones. She also noticed Vanessa watching her. She told herself she was imagining it. The seam at the left side panel of her dress shifted again around 9 o'clock, when she was standing near the bar talking to a quiet, bearded man named Frank, who turned out to manage acquisitions for a mid-sized real estate firm and was genuinely interested in custom suits for his team. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A small give in the fabric, a loosening. Evelyn's stomach contracted. She excused herself politely and found a restroom down a side corridor, locked the door, and examined the seam in the mirror. The thread was going. Not all at once. It was designed not to go all at once. Whoever had picked it had done it carefully, loosening every third or fourth stitch so that the fabric held under normal movement but couldn't sustain anything more. Under the right circumstance, a stretch, a turn, a raised arm, the left panel would separate from the bodice in a way that would leave her exposed from her ribcage to her hip. Evelyn stared at herself in the mirror for a long moment. She thought about the note. Wear this. Trust me, you'll thank me later. She thought about Vanessa's face in the lobby, that fraction of a second expression she hadn't been able to name. She named it now. Anticipation. Her first instinct was to leave, just leave, find her coat, find the exit, get back to the apartment, and be done with it. She had done nothing wrong. She didn't owe this room or these people anything. She could go home and she could work, and she could survive the way she always had, quietly, without incident, without anyone seeing. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and thought about the heating repair bill. She thought about her father, who was 61 and had a bad back, and had been between jobs for 4 months after the restaurant where he'd worked for 9 years had closed without warning. She thought about the shop lease. She dried her hands, straightened the dress carefully, the seam held for now, if she moved cautiously, and went back out. She should have left. She should have left the moment Petra touched her arm 40 minutes later and said, with warm sincerity that Evelyn had spent a lifetime learning to distrust, "You absolutely have to come meet Helena Marsh. She's on the acquisition committee for the City Arts Council. She's been asking about local designers." And Evelyn had followed her, threading through the crowd, trying to hold her body at the precise angle that kept the weakened seam stable. And Petra had led her to the center of the room, to a cluster of 8 or 10 people that included Vanessa and Margot, and a silver-haired woman who was probably Helena Marsh, and Evelyn had smiled and started to extend her hand. And Petra had knocked her arm. She would think later that it was deliberate, though she could never prove it, could never prove anything about that night except what she felt in her own body. Knocked her arm hard with the edge of her elbow, and Evelyn stumbled, one hand going out to catch her balance, the other arm swinging wide, and the seam went. It didn't tear dramatically. It simply opened. The left panel of the bodice separated from the dress with a quiet sound that no one else would have heard over the music and the conversation. But the effect was immediate and unmistakable. The fabric gaped. In the cold light of the chandelier, with 10 people now looking directly at her, Evelyn stood with her dress falling open from her left side and had exactly 3 seconds where her mind went completely blank. Then Vanessa laughed. Not the public laugh, the real one. Surprised out of her almost, the way genuine reactions sometimes escaped people before the performance layer could catch them. Just a single sound, half a second, instantly swallowed back behind a hand pressed to her mouth. But it was enough. Because Petra laughed too, and Margot turned away with a deliberateness that was its own kind of cruelty. And 2 of the other people in the cluster simply stared, and the silver-haired woman, who was probably Helena Marsh, looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of someone watching an embarrassment they don't intend to involve themselves in. Someone said, "Oh my," in the tone people used for minor disasters. Evelyn pulled the fabric closed with her left hand and held it there. Her face was burning. She could feel the heat of it from her throat to her temples, the kind of flush that came from humiliation rather than shame, because she hadn't done anything to be ashamed of. She was only ashamed of how badly she wanted to disappear. She had wanted to disappear her entire life, and right now, standing in the center of the Wintercrest Gala, with her hand clutching her dress together while Vanessa composed her mouth back into appropriate concern, and said, "Evie, sweetheart, are you all right?" She wanted it more than she had ever wanted anything. She didn't cry. She was proud of that later. She didn't cry, and she didn't run, and she didn't say anything to Vanessa because anything she said would be used or twisted or dismissed, and she had known that since she was 8 years old, and she wasn't going to forget it now. She said, "Excuse me," in a voice she didn't recognize as her own, too flat, too quiet, and she walked. Not toward the exit. She didn't want to cross the length of the ballroom with her hand pressed to her side like she was holding herself together. She walked toward the far end of the room, where the tall French doors opened onto a terrace that looked out over the dark shape of Millennium Park and the frozen edge of the lakefront. She pushed through the nearest set of doors, and the cold hit her like a wall, hard and immediate and almost welcome, because it stopped the burning in her face and gave her something physical to process instead. The terrace was empty. It was far too cold for anyone sensible to be outside. The iron railing was glazed with ice, and the stones under her feet were treacherous, and the champagne she'd drunk earlier sat uneasily in her stomach, and Evelyn walked to the railing anyway and gripped it with both hands, her right hand, because her left was still holding the dress together, and looked out at the park below. She didn't cry. She wasn't going to cry. She was calculating. That was what she did when she was frightened and cornered, she calculated. She measured. She tried to find the thread she could pull to hold things together. How long had Vanessa been planning this? Whether the photographer she'd noticed near the cluster of people had gotten a shot before Evelyn moved. Whether any of the people from her brief conversations earlier had seen what happened, and how quickly that would move through whatever networks connected this room. Whether Frank from real estate would still be interested in custom suits, or whether this was the kind of story that followed a person. She was so deep in her own calculations that she didn't hear the French door open behind her. She heard the match strike. The sound was unmistakable, the sharp rasp of a wooden match against its box. Then the brief flare she saw reflected in the window of the door to her right, a small, warm doubling of light against all the cold. She turned. He was standing at the far end of the terrace, near a stone column, and she hadn't seen him because he was the kind of person who occupied shadow with complete ease, the kind of person who was always exactly where he intended to be. He was tall, not dramatically so, but enough. Dark coat, no tie, which meant he was either someone who didn't need to perform that particular deference or someone who had decided the room didn't warrant it. He held the match to a cigarette she hadn't noticed, drew on it once, and shook the match out. He hadn't looked at her. Or rather, he'd glanced at her when she turned, the quick, assessing look of someone establishing that a new presence in a space was not a threat, and then he'd looked away. Back at the city. Back at the dark mass of the park and the distant line of the lake. She should have gone back inside. She didn't. She turned back to the railing and tried to reset her breathing, and the cold kept coming, that particular Chicago January cold that didn't negotiate, and she stood there in her ruined dress with her hand pressed to her side, and she was shaking now, although she wasn't sure how much of it was temperature. "You're holding the seam." She turned. He was looking at her now, not with the social look that people used at events like this. The smile cocked at half-mast, the practiced interest, but directly, steadily, with the kind of attention that most people reserved for things that actually mattered to them. He had a long face, a jaw that looked like it had been broken once and healed slightly wrong, dark eyes that didn't give anything away for free. "Excuse me?" she said. "Your left hand. You're holding the seam closed." His voice was low and had a flatness to it, a mid-American absence of affect that wasn't coldness so much as economy. "Loose thread or cut?" She stared at him. "How do you know the difference?" "Because loose thread you'd be annoyed. You look like something else." The something else was humiliation, but she wasn't going to say that to a stranger on a freezing terrace. "It was sewn to fail," she said, and she heard the anger in her own voice for the first time, clean and sharp under everything else. Someone altered the stitching. He drew on the cigarette once more and exhaled toward the park. "Someone at the party?" "Someone before the party." He nodded, like this was a piece of information he was filing. Not shocked, not performing sympathy, just cataloging. "Do you want to go back in?" The question caught her off guard because it wasn't, "Are you okay?" or "That's terrible," or any of the soft-edged social responses she'd been bracing for. It was practical, operational. "Do you want to go back in?" As though going back in were a choice she was making rather than something she'd been pushed away from. "I need to," she said. I was talking to people about work. The seam's going to go the rest of the way if you move wrong." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced something she didn't expect. A small fold of black fabric, not quite the size of her palm, and a safety pin. The safety pin was gold. It looked like it had been there for a while. She blinked. "You carry a safety pin." "My assistant makes me. In case of—" He paused, something that wasn't quite a smile moving at the corner of his mouth. "Structural failures." Evelyn looked at the safety pin and looked at him. She was a professional. She understood that a safety pin through silk was an amateur solution, and the seam would still be visible as damaged, and this would not in any meaningful way fix what had happened to her. But the alternative was standing here until the party ended, or going back in the way she was, and neither of those was acceptable. "If you're going to use it, you have 3 options," she said, because she couldn't help herself, because seams were the one thing she knew with certainty. Through the facing, if there is one, through the underlining if the facing is too thin, or skip the pin and use the cloth as a belt anchor, which is what that fabric is for. He looked at her for a second. "You know about sewing." "I'm a seamstress. At this party. Looking for clients." Something shifted in his face, very slightly. Not softening, more like a recalibration, like he'd processed one version of her and was now replacing it with a different one. He held out the fabric and the pin. "Your call." She looked at her options. She took the fabric. It took her 90 seconds, working one-handed in the cold, with fingers that had lost some of their feeling, to create an anchor from the black cloth that drew the gaping seam closed and held it against the bodice without pinning through the outer fabric. It wouldn't pass close inspection, but it would hold through a room. She finished and tested it with a careful breath. Held. "Efficient," the man said. "I've been mending things since I was a teenager." She smoothed the fabric and looked at him again. "Thank you. For the pin. Hasn't done much. It's done enough." He looked at her in that steady, unreadable way again. The cigarette had burned down without him noticing. He looked at it with mild surprise, dropped it, stepped on it with a polished shoe. "You're going back in." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "The person who did this to your dress. She's going to be in there." Evelyn went very still. "I didn't say it was a she." "No," he agreed. She studied him. "You know who I am." "I know you came in with Vanessa Crowley." A cold feeling moved through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. "How long were you out here?" "Long enough." He didn't say it threateningly. He said it the way you'd report a weather condition. "You didn't do anything wrong. In case you're calculating whether you did." She resented suddenly and intensely how accurately he'd read her. "I don't need—" "I'm not offering reassurance. I'm noting a fact." He looked out at the park. You can take it or leave it. Evelyn pulled her coat from where she'd left it draped over a patio chair. She hadn't wanted to wear it inside, had folded it there when she'd first come out, though that felt like a long time ago now, and held it in her arms like a shield, which was exactly what it was. She looked at the man again. He had turned back toward the doors, not blocking them, simply orienting, as if he were waiting without indicating that he was. There was something familiar about him that she couldn't place, some quality in the stillness that reminded her of something she'd been trying not to think about for the last 6 months, a quality of compressed danger at rest, like a machine that was off but was not, you understood, harmless. "I don't know your name," she said. "No," he said. "You don't." And he reached past her and opened the French door, and the warmth of the ballroom came out to meet the cold, and Evelyn Hart walked back into the room that had just broken something in her, and she didn't know yet that the man behind her was the reason the next 6 months of her life were going to be nothing like the 30 years that had come before. Inside, the party had metabolized her humiliation the way parties always did, quickly, into cocktail conversation, into a story that would be told in tighter, funnier, more embellished form over the following week. Evelyn felt it immediately when she crossed the threshold, the slight change in the room's texture around her, the few pairs of eyes that found her and looked away too deliberately, the kind of social radiation that told you exactly where you stood in a room's estimation. She held her head at the angle that meant nothing, the neutral angle, the one she'd calibrated over years of existing in spaces that didn't particularly want her. Vanessa appeared at her side within 2 minutes, which was either guilt or surveillance, and Evelyn had long since stopped distinguishing between the two where her cousin was concerned. "Evie, I was so worried. Are you all right? These old dresses, the fabric just—" "The stitching was cut," Evelyn said. She kept her voice conversational. She was watching Vanessa's face. Vanessa's expression didn't crack. It was very good. "Cut? What are you talking about? That's loose thread fails from the strain. Cut thread fails from the angle." Evelyn had heard her father's old teacher say it 100 times, and now it was in her mouth like iron. This failed from the angle. "Evie, I honestly don't know where you're getting—" "I'm not going to make a scene," Evelyn said. "I'm going to stay another hour and speak with the people I came here to speak with, and then I'm going to go home. And we're not going to talk about this tonight." Vanessa looked at her. Something very brief and very cold moved across her face before the performance returned, all warm concern and puzzlement. "Of course. Whatever you need." Evelyn nodded and walked away. She found Frank from real estate near the bar, still nursing the same drink, and they talked for 20 more minutes about a project he was developing that would need 12 executive suits and a company uniform design for his administrative staff. She took his card. She gave him hers. She was professional and focused, and she would think later that these 20 minutes were the most genuinely effective thing she did all year, because Frank DeLuca turned out to be the first major client to walk through her shop door. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew, navigating back through the room toward the exit with her coat over her arm and her hand steady at her side and her face composed into its most neutral register, was that something had shifted in her chest during the 45 minutes on that terrace that she couldn't quite identify yet. Some calculation had changed. Some small, persistent voice that usually told her to be smaller, quieter, less visible, less demanding of space, had gone temporarily offline. She was in the lobby, reaching for her phone to call a car, when the room behind her changed. She felt it before she heard it. A change in the quality of conversation. Not silence exactly, but a modulation, a shift in the way voices moved. The kind of thing that happened when someone who mattered to the room moved through it. She turned. He was crossing the ballroom. She could see him through the glass panels of the lobby doors, moving with the kind of economy that suggested he had never in his life needed to perform for a room and had no intention of starting now. He was heading toward a table near the center where a man in a gray suit was already on his feet and 3 other people had straightened almost imperceptibly in their chairs. But that wasn't what stopped her breathing. What stopped her breathing was the woman to his left, a woman she recognized from somewhere she couldn't immediately place, who leaned toward him and said something that made him turn his head. And in the profile, she saw something about the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the quality of stillness that she had been trying to place all evening. She placed it now. 6 months ago, on a night in September when the rain had come down so hard, the gutters overflowed and the alley behind her shop had turned into a half-inch river, she had worked late on a commission she couldn't afford to delay. She had heard the sound at 11:45, not a crash, not a shout, but something that had moved under those categories, a weight of something going wrong. She had gone into the alley with her phone and its flashlight and found a man against the dumpster, one hand pressing his side, his face as white as the reflection of her light in the water at his feet. She hadn't asked questions. She knew better. She'd grown up in this part of the city long enough to know that there were some situations where asking questions was the most dangerous thing you could do. She'd gone back inside, gotten her emergency kit, which she kept stocked because her father was accident-prone and her landlord's maintenance response time was roughly never, and spent 40 minutes doing things she'd learned from a first aid course she'd taken because she was the kind of person who took first aid courses, never imagining she would use them in a rainy alley at midnight. She hadn't asked who he was. She hadn't asked what had happened. She hadn't called anyone. When she was done, when she'd said this needs a doctor, you need a hospital, he had said no in a voice that did not invite negotiation. And she had said, you lose consciousness, I call anyway. And he had looked at her in a way that she had never forgotten, like she had surprised him, like being talked back to was something that happened rarely enough to register. He had left before dawn. He had left a fold of cash on her workbench that she hadn't touched for a week, hadn't touched until her landlord called, hadn't touched until she stopped being able to afford principals. She had never learned his name. She stood in the lobby of the Castellan Hotel with her phone in her hand and her heart doing something she didn't have a category for, watching the most feared man in Chicago settle into a chair while the room reorganized itself around him. The man from the terrace. The man from the alley. She understood now why she hadn't recognized him immediately. He had been reduced that night in September. Smaller in the way that pain made people smaller, stripped of whatever it was he was standing here wrapped in, so naturally that it seemed like a second skin. He hadn't looked powerful against that dumpster. He had looked like something that could die. Now he looked like something else entirely. She must have made a sound or a movement because he looked up. From across the ballroom, through the glass of the lobby doors, their eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply looked at her, the same way he'd looked at her on the terrace, that steady, economical attention. And something passed between them that she couldn't name. Some recognition that was not comfortable, that was not warm, that was not any of the things that recognitions at parties were supposed to be. Evelyn looked away first. She looked at her phone. She called the car. In the car on the way back across the city, she sat with her coat in her lap and her hands folded on top of it. And she did not think about the terrace, and she did not think about the alley, and she tried not to think about the way he had looked at her through the glass. She thought about the heating bill. She thought about the lease. She thought about Frank DeLuca's business card in her coat pocket. She was good at not thinking about things. She had been doing it for 30 years. She went home, took the dress off, examined the cut seams under proper light. Precise, deliberate, the work of someone with a basic knowledge of construction, and folded it on the workbench with the intention of analyzing it more thoroughly in the morning. She changed into her oldest sweater and ate the toast she made because she'd forgotten to eat dinner, and she sat at her kitchen table in the cold apartment above the shop and made a list of follow-up actions for the people she'd spoken to at the party. Frank DeLuca, Delphine from the theater company, the woman from the charitable foundation. She added the date and circled it. She did not add a name she didn't have. She went to bed at 1 in the morning and lay in the dark and thought about the way Vanessa had laughed. That real laugh. The one she couldn't control. The one that said, "This is exactly what I planned." She thought about what that meant, carefully and methodically, as she always thought about things that frightened her. It meant that Vanessa wanted something from her, not embarrassment for its own sake. Vanessa was too calculating for cruelty without purpose. Embarrassment as a means, a way of positioning her, of keeping her in a specific place relative to the people in that room. Evelyn turned onto her side and looked at the faint light from the street lamp coming through the thin curtain. She thought about what she had in that room that Vanessa could want, and she came up with very little, and the absence of an obvious answer disturbed her more than a clear threat would have. She fell asleep at 2:15. At 6:12 in the morning, the buzzer for the shop downstairs rang. She assumed it was a delivery. Deliveries came at odd hours when suppliers were running routes. and went down in her sweater and sweatpants, her hair not yet brushed, squinting in the stairwell light. She opened the workroom door onto the rear alley. A man she didn't recognize stood there with a flat paper bag from the bakery 2 streets over, a place that made the specific kind of almond croissant she bought as a treat on slow Saturdays. The man was young, well-dressed for 6 in the morning, and had the careful, neutral posture of someone used to delivering things without being asked questions. "Miss Hart," he said. He held out the bag. She looked at the bag. She looked at him. She didn't take it. "Who sent this?" "There's a card," he said. She opened the bag and found the croissant wrapped in wax paper, and under it a small card, the size of a business card but heavier, better stock. On one side, 2 words in a handwriting she didn't recognize. "Thank you." She turned the card over. Nothing else. She stood in the cold doorway of her workroom with the flat bag in her hands and felt something she had no name for, something that was not quite fear, and not quite relief, and not any of the things she would have expected to feel. She looked at the young man, who was already stepping back. "Wait," she said. He paused. "Tell him we're even," she said. He nodded once and left. Evelyn went back inside and sat at the workbench with the croissant and a cup of coffee she made badly because she was thinking too hard. And she ate and looked at the dress folded at the end of the bench with its cut seams, and she looked at the business card from Frank DeLuca sitting next to her follow-up list, and she looked at the small card with 2 words on it. "Thank you." 3 days later, the man with the broken jaw and the economical manner walked into her tailoring shop for the first time with a jacket he said needed the lining replaced. She looked at the jacket for less than 30 seconds before she said, "The lining is fine." He looked at the jacket. He looked at her. "You sure?" "I'm a seamstress." "Right." A pause. "The collar, then?" "The collar is also fine." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. A cousin of one. "I'll think of something." And he set the jacket on her counter, and she looked at him across it, and neither of them said what was actually true, which was that he had come here deliberately, which was that she had known before the bell above the door finished ringing that it was him, which was that whatever had started in a dark alley 6 months ago had not ended the way either of them had assumed it would. "I never asked your name," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Damien Vescari." She held that name for a moment, turning it over, feeling its weight, recognizing it the way you recognize something you'd been warned about but hoped you'd never encounter. The name everyone in this part of Chicago knew. The name you didn't say casually, if you were careful, if you were smart. She nodded once, the way she had nodded at facts all her life. The heating bill, the lease, the cut seam, acknowledging without flinching. "Evelyn Hart," she said. "And you don't need your collar fixed." "No," he agreed. "Then what do you need?" He was quiet for a moment, just long enough to make the question honest. "I don't know yet," he said. And that answer, that quiet, unexpected admission from the most dangerous man in Chicago, was the thing Evelyn Hart could not stop thinking about for the rest of the week, through the follow-up call with Frank DeLuca and the measurement appointment with the theater company and the 3 other jackets and pairs of trousers that came through the shop in the ordinary, unpredictable rhythm of work. She thought about it while she pinned and measured and cut. She thought about it while the heating unit finally gave out completely and the repair crew arrived the following Thursday. A crew she hadn't called and hadn't been billed for, from a company she couldn't find when she searched the name on their van. She thought about it when her father called on Friday evening, surprised and confused, to tell her that the management company of the building where he'd been trying to find steady work had called him in for an interview, and that the man who interviewed him had known his name before he'd given it, and that he had left with a maintenance position that came with health insurance and a salary that made him go quiet on the phone for a moment in a way that told her he was trying not to cry. She stood in the middle of her workroom with the phone pressed to her ear and listened to her father not cry, and she felt the careful, measured world she had built for herself over 30 years begin to shift, very slightly, off its foundation. She had been careful her whole life. She had been invisible her whole life. She had measured the cost of everything and paid it without complaint and asked for nothing from anyone because asking was dangerous, and receiving was dangerous, and being seen was the most dangerous thing of all. And now Damien Vescari had seen her. In the alley, in the dark, when she was doing the only thing she knew how to do, which was hold things together that were trying to come apart. And she didn't know, couldn't know yet, standing in her workroom on a Friday night with her father's voice on the phone and her hands already reaching for the next thing that needed to be fixed. She didn't know that being seen by that specific man in that specific way was going to change every calculation she had ever made. She was still holding the phone when the other call came in. Not her phone, the shop phone. The landline she kept on the counter for clients who didn't have her cell number. The phone that rang maybe twice a week on a good week. It rang now at 8:43 on a Friday night, which was not a business hour, which meant it was not a client. She told her father she'd call him tomorrow. She picked up the landline. Miss Hart. A woman's voice, precise and unhurried, with the particular confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to the first time. You had an appointment request submitted through your website this evening, a full wardrobe consultation, 12 pieces, with a fitting date to be determined. The deposit has already been transferred. Evelyn looked at her laptop, open on the cutting table. She hadn't checked her email since morning. I didn't see a request come through. It was submitted 30 minutes ago. The client's name is Reyes, Marcus Reyes. A pause. He was referred by a mutual contact. Evelyn didn't say anything for a moment. What mutual contact? The referral was noted as personal. Another pause, finer than the first. Mr. Reyes is in property development. He has several associates with similar needs. This could be a significant ongoing relationship for your business. Evelyn set the landline down on the cutting table without hanging it up and opened her laptop. The email was there. The deposit notification from her payment processor was there. An amount that made her look at the screen for a long moment before she picked the phone back up. "Who is this?" she said. "My name is Clara. I manage Mr. Vescari's scheduling." The workroom was very quiet. Outside, a car went past on the street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the front windows. "He shouldn't be doing this," Evelyn said. "Mr. Vescari." "Tell him I said thank you and I don't need his help arranging my clients." A silence that was not uncomfortable on Clara's end. The silence of someone who had delivered difficult messages before and was not frightened of the responses. "I'll pass that along, Miss Hart." "Tell him it's not an insult. Tell him I understand what he's trying to do." She paused. "Tell him we're not there yet." She hung up. She sat down on the stool at the cutting table. She did not look at the deposit notification again. She transferred it back in the morning. Well, Damien came into the shop the following Tuesday. Not the jacket this time. No pretense. He came in at 11:15, which was between her 9 o'clock alteration appointment and her 12:30 fitting, which suggested either coincidence or surveillance, and she had stopped believing in coincidence where he was concerned. He sat down in the single chair she kept for waiting clients. A worn armchair she'd rescued from the sidewalk outside an estate sale on Wicker Park 2 years ago and reupholstered herself in a dark green fabric. And he looked at her workroom with the same methodical attention he gave to everything. "You sent the money back," he said. "Yes." She was hemming a pair of trousers, not looking up. "Reyes is a real client. I didn't invent him." "I know." "He needs 12 pieces." "I know. And when he calls me himself, I'll take the appointment." She finally looked up. "I don't take referrals from men who don't tell me their names on terraces." He absorbed that. "Fair." "It's not about fair, it's about how I run my business." She set down the trousers. "You fixed my father's job." He didn't confirm or deny it. He looked at her. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," he agreed. "My father can find his own work." He was. Badly. A pause. The maintenance position fits his experience exactly. The building needed someone. It wasn't manufactured. But the interview was. He held her gaze. The introduction was. She breathed out. She picked up the trousers again. "I need you to understand something. I spent every year of my adult life making sure that the people around me couldn't use my needs against me. I don't let people do things for me that I didn't ask for because then I owe things I never agreed to owe. That's not paranoia. That's how I've stayed functional." "I understand that." "Then why?" He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that she looked up again. His face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. A slight compression around the eyes. a restraint that read less like blankness and more like careful management of something that didn't usually get managed. Because you didn't ask for anything in that alley, he said. Most people would have. Most people would have asked questions and extracted agreements before they did a thing. You didn't. You just... He stopped, started again, differently. You just handled it. She looked at him. That's not a reason to reorganize someone's life. No, it's not. Then what is? He didn't answer that, which was, she was already learning, its own kind of answer. He came back Thursday. Genuinely, this time, a coat with a button that had pulled loose from the facing, a real repair, small enough that she could have told him to take it anywhere. She suspected that was the point. She did the repair while he sat in the green chair and watched her work, and they talked about things that were not the alley, and not the party, and not the money, and she found, with the specific discomfort of someone whose survival depended on accurate assessment, that he was easier to be around than he had any right to be. Not warm. She didn't want to overstate it. He didn't perform warmth, didn't do the thing that men with power sometimes did, the expansive, generous performance of interest that was designed to make you feel chosen. He was simply present, attentive without demanding. He asked questions that were direct and specific and actually waited for the full answer before formulating the next one, which was rarer than people understood. She told him about the business, about the difficulty of finding clients who could sustain a custom shop when fast fashion had reset everyone's understanding of what clothing should cost. About the commission structure she'd built, the theater and arts accounts that kept her solvent in slow months, the corporate clients who were worth cultivating even when they were frustrating. He listened. He asked a question about the cost of her materials that was more sophisticated than she expected, and she revised her assessment of him slightly upward. Then she revised it again when he said, without transition, "Vanessa Crowley has been asking about you." She kept her hands moving on the coat. "Asking who?" "People who know me." A pause. "She's been asking what my connection to you is, how long we've known each other, whether you've been to my office." Evelyn set down the coat very carefully. "What did your people tell her?" "Nothing. That's not how my people work." "But she's looking." "Yes." "Why would she care?" She said it out loud, but she was already working through it, already pulling the threads. Vanessa had wanted her at the gala for a reason. The dress had been a tool, not a tantrum. Vanessa didn't waste energy on personal cruelty without a purpose behind it. If she'd wanted to humiliate Evelyn publicly in front of the people at that table, it was because she'd wanted those people to see something specific. She'd wanted them to see Evelyn reduced, small, out of place. If she was now asking about Damien's connection to Evelyn, it meant the reduction had not worked the way she planned, because of the brooch. "What is it?" Damien asked. Evelyn looked at him. She'd almost forgotten he was watching her think. "The brooch? You pinned your brooch to my dress." "Yes." "In front of those people." "Yes." "What does it mean? To them?" She kept her voice flat and procedural. "That specific brooch, in that room, what does it signal?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive. She had started to be able to tell the difference between the quiet of someone who was calculating a deception and the quiet of someone who was deciding how much truth to deliver. This was the second kind. "That you're under my protection," he said, "in the context of that world. That anyone who moves against you moves against me." She sat with that for a moment. "And you did that to a stranger." "I did that to someone I recognized." "You owed me a debt, not protection." "Yes," he said. "And now Vanessa Crowley is asking my associates questions she shouldn't be asking, and I want you to know why." She looked at her hands. "Is she dangerous?" "She runs in circles with people who are. Crowley money has been adjacent to some unfriendly interests for a long time." He paused. "How much do you actually know about your cousin?" "I know she's calculating, she's patient, and she doesn't do anything without a return." She looked up. "I know her family has money that predates her career by a generation and doesn't quite match the career earnings. I never asked more than that because it wasn't my business." "It may be now." The bell above the shop door rang. They both looked up. Through the workroom doorway she could see the front window, and through it, the figure of a woman on the sidewalk who had not come to the door but had simply paused in front of the shop, hands in the pockets of a long coat, face turned toward the window. Vanessa. Not looking in, or not appearing to look in. Just paused. The way someone paused to check a phone, or to pull their scarf tighter, or for any of a dozen neutral reasons. Damien had gone completely still. He was watching Vanessa on the sidewalk with an attention that was different from the attention he gave everything else, more compressed, more focused, the attention of someone calculating response rather than processing information. Vanessa moved on, down the sidewalk, unhurried, turning the corner without looking back. Damien's eyes moved to Evelyn. That wasn't a coincidence, Evelyn said. No. She felt it then, the thing she'd been holding at a distance since the gala, the reality of what had happened when he'd pinned that brooch to her dress. The way it had not resolved anything had in fact opened something, drawn something toward her that she had spent her entire life organizing her existence to avoid. I need you to be honest with me, she said, about what pinning that brooch to my dress actually started. He looked at her steadily. It started a conversation in a world you don't belong to. People are asking who you are to me. Some of them are curious, some of them are concerned, and some of them see you as something they might be able to use. Use how? As leverage, as a message, as a way to test whether I've made an attachment that can be exploited. The word attachment sat between them like a third object. And have you? She said. He held her gaze. I haven't decided what I've made. It was the most honest thing she'd heard anyone say in a very long time, and it was also the most frightening, and the combination of those two things was what made it impossible to dismiss. 2 weeks passed. The Reyes commission came through without introduction. Marcus Reyes called the shop himself, said he'd seen her work through a mutual contact in the theater world, which might even have been true, and by the end of the call she had an appointment scheduled and a scope of 12 pieces that would cover the shop's overhead for 4 months. Her father called twice, happy in a way she hadn't heard in 2 years. He liked the job. He liked the building manager. He liked having somewhere to be. Damien came in twice more, real repairs, small ones, things he could have handled elsewhere. She charged him her standard rate. He paid without comment. They talked, and she was careful about what the talking meant to her, about what she allowed herself to enjoy about it, because she had been careful all her life, and she was not prepared to stop being careful now. Then the woman came in. She came in on a Wednesday afternoon, young, precise, attractive in the specific way of someone who worked at it, wearing a coat that cost more than Evelyn's monthly lease. She said her name was Danny. She said she was a stylist. She said she was looking for someone to handle alterations for a small private client list and had been referred to Evelyn's shop. Evelyn made tea and they sat in the consultation area and talked for 20 minutes. And at some point in those 20 minutes, Evelyn understood that Danny was not a stylist, or not only a stylist, and that she had not come here to talk about alterations. Who referred you? Evelyn asked. Danny smiled with her mouth only. A mutual friend. Give me a name. A pause. Lena Marchetti. Evelyn had never heard the name. I don't know Alina Marchetti. She knows you. Danny set down her tea. She knows about the alley, Miss Hart. September. She knows what you did that night, and she knows it's put you in a complicated position. She's concerned about you. Evelyn was very still. Who is Lena Marchetti? She runs a hospitality business in River North. A careful pause. She and Damien Viscari have a long history. Evelyn looked at her hands, then back at Danny. What kind of history? The complicated kind. Danny's voice didn't shift, didn't warm or cool. She's not here to cause trouble. She's here because you're a civilian who's been pulled into something that has weight you may not understand yet, and she thinks you deserve to know what you're looking at before it's too late to make a different choice. What choice? Danny leaned forward very slightly. Whether to stay in Damien Vescari's orbit, or whether to quietly step back now, before the people who are watching you decide you're a permanent feature. A beat. There are people in his world who will use you, Miss Hart, not against him, to reach him. They'll do it through you because you're unprotected. He said I was protected. By him. Danny sat back. And he's not always there. Evelyn looked at the window. The afternoon light was flat and gray, the sky carrying the look of weather building. Why does Lena Marchetti care what happens to me? Because she spent 8 years carrying what happens to Damien Viscari, and she's learned that the fastest way to damage him is through the people he decides to care about. A pause. And he's decided to care about you, whether or not he's admitted that to himself yet. Evelyn stood. She refilled her tea because it gave her something to do with her hands, something to look at that wasn't Danny's careful, watchful face. She stood at the small kettle and breathed. The truth was, she had known this was coming. She had known it in the workroom when he'd told her about Vanessa asking questions, had felt the shape of it then, the way that one gesture, the brooch, had redrawn the map of how certain people saw her. She was no longer a seamstress above a shop on a street in Logan Square. She was a variable in someone else's calculation. She turned around. "Tell Lena Marchetti I appreciate the concern," she said. "Tell her I'm going to make my own decisions." Danny looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded, once, and put on her coat, and left. Evelyn stood in the empty consultation area and listened to the silence of the shop around her. The fabric on the shelves, the spools of thread by color, the smell of the iron she'd left cooling on its heel, and the faint chemical scent of the dry cleaning bags she kept for finished garments. Everything in its right place. She called Damien at the number he'd left on the back of a card she hadn't asked for. He answered on the second ring. "Someone came to the shop," she said. "She said her name was Danny. She said she was sent by Lena Marchetti." A silence on his end. The specific kind. "What did she say?" "She said I was unprotected. She said people in your world would use me." A beat. "She said Lena Marchetti has spent 8 years caring about what happens to you." Another silence. Longer. She could hear him breathing, could hear whatever room he was in, low voices in the background that stopped when he moved, or the room moved around him. "Lena," he said finally, "is someone I used to trust." "Used to, until I understood what her version of care looked like." His voice was flat. Not angry. She'd heard him manage anger, knew the slight tightening that happened in it. This was something else. Something older. "She's not dangerous to you, but she's not warning you out of concern either." "Then why?" "Because you're new. Because she doesn't know what you are yet, and she'd rather remove you before she has to figure it out." A pause. "Because the fastest way to find out how important someone is to me is to try to take them away." Evelyn sat very still with the phone pressed to her ear. "And?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "And nothing. I'm telling you what's happening." "That's not what I'm asking." "I know what you're asking." "Then answer it." Another pause. The longest. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to say anything, that he was going to deflect the way he sometimes did, give her true information arranged to avoid the real thing. "You matter," he said. "I don't have better language for it than that. I don't usually talk about this kind of thing because I don't usually have it." A beat. "That's probably going to be a problem for you." She breathed out slowly. "It's already a problem." "Yes." "Damien." She said his name deliberately. First time she'd used it directly like that, and she felt him register it even through the phone. "I need to know that you understand the difference between protecting someone and making their decisions for them." "I understand the difference." "Do you?" He didn't answer immediately. "I'm trying to." It was the right answer and the wrong answer at the same time, and she sat with it in the quiet of her shop while the afternoon turned toward evening outside the windows, and she was still sitting with it 20 minutes later when she heard the sound in the alley behind the workroom. Not the crash or shout she'd been bracing for since Danny's visit. Subtler than that. The sound of something deliberate. Movement that was trying not to be heard. She stood up slowly. She looked at the back door. The heavy one, steel, that she kept bolted from inside because the neighborhood was not what it used to be, and she had learned a long time ago not to give people easy access to things she couldn't afford to replace. The sound came again. A weight shifting. More than one person. She had her phone in her hand and she was already dialing when the bolt on the back door began to move, working from the outside with something that was not a key, and she understood with a cold clarity that cut through every calculation she'd ever made, that being seen had a cost she was about to pay, and that the cost she hadn't finished calculating was already here. The bolt moved a second time and then stopped. The silence that followed was the wrong kind of silence. Not absence, but held breath. The silence of people on the other side of a door deciding something. Evelyn was already moving, not toward the back door but sideways, to the cutting table, where her hand found the long shears without looking, because she had worked in this room for 4 years and she knew every surface by feel in the dark. 8-inch blades, German steel, heavy enough to mean something in the hand. She dialed with her thumb. Damien picked up before the first ring finished. She didn't say anything. She held the phone toward the door for 2 seconds so he could hear what she was hearing, then brought it back to her ear. "Don't open it," he said. "I wasn't going to." "Move away from the door, to the front of the shop. Lock the interior door between rooms." She was already walking, already doing it, the shears in her right hand and the phone in her left. Through the workroom door into the narrow hall that connected the back of the shop to the front, and she threw the bolt on the interior door and stood in the front room among the display forms and the bolts of fabric and the green chair, and she breathed. "I'm in the front," she said. "Good. Don't move." His voice had changed, not louder, smaller, more compressed, the way a flame got smaller and hotter when you reduce the oxygen. "Someone is going to knock on your front door in approximately 90 seconds. Let them in." She looked at the front door. The street beyond it was empty, the evening light nearly gone, the street lamp at the corner doing its inadequate job. "Who?" "Ramirez. He works for me. He's been outside since 4. She absorbed that. "Since 4. Since Danny left your shop." She stood in the middle of the front room with this information and felt something shift in her chest that was not comfort and was not anger, but occupied the complicated space between them. He had put someone outside her shop. He had done it without telling her. He had been right to do it and wrong to do it, and she didn't have time to sort that out right now. The knock came. 3 times even, unhurried. A specific pattern. She unlocked the front door. The man outside was compact, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, wearing a jacket that didn't quite hide the fact that he was carrying something under his left arm. He had a face that had seen weather and taken it personally. He looked at her, looked at the shears in her hand, and nodded with the mild approval of someone who found basic precaution reasonable. "Miss Hart, I'm Ramirez." His voice was quiet. "There were 2 of them in the alley. They're gone now." She let out a breath she hadn't tracked. "Gone. They left when I came around the building." He paused. "They weren't professional. Sent to frighten, not to take." "Sent by who?" He looked at her without answering, which was its own answer. She put the phone back to her ear. "Damien, I heard. Who sent them?" A pause. 1 beat. "We're working on that." She looked at Ramirez, who was watching her with the careful neutrality of a man accustomed to being caught between his employer and a complication his employer hadn't fully anticipated. She looked at the dark alley door at the back of the shop, still bolted. "I want to know when you find out," she said into the phone. "You will. Not a summary, the actual information. Evelyn, that's the condition. You want me to trust your people in my shop and outside my door? That's the condition." He was quiet. "All right." She hung up. She looked at Ramirez. "There's a chair in the back. You want coffee?" He blinked, just once. "No, ma'am, thank you." "Then I'm going to finish the hem I was in the middle of," she said. "And you're going to do whatever you do, and we're going to pretend this evening is normal." He looked at her for another moment, and she understood that she had surprised him. She seemed to be doing that to a lot of people lately. "Yes, ma'am," he said.
Yes, sir.
The answer came 3 days later. Not from Damien, from her father. He called at 7 in the morning, which was early for him, early enough that she knew before she answered that something had happened that he didn't want to give her time to brace for. She was at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee, and the morning still dark at the window, and she answered and heard in his voice the specific combination of guilt and dread that she associated with the worst conversations of her life. "Evie," he said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I didn't know how bad it was. I didn't know what it would turn into." She set down her cup. "Dad, the money I borrowed 2 years ago when the restaurant was cutting hours and I was behind and I was embarrassed to tell you, and someone offered—" He stopped, started again. "Vanessa offered." Evelyn was very still. "She said it was a family loan, no interest, no timeline. She said it was what family did." He was talking faster now, the way people talked when they were trying to get through something before they lost the nerve. I took 14,000, Evie. I paid back 8. I still have 6 outstanding. I thought she was... Dad. She kept her voice even. When did she contact you about the remaining balance? A silence. Last week. What did she say? Another silence, longer and heavier. She said she wasn't going to ask for the money. She said she wanted a favor instead. She said she wanted to know... His voice dropped. She wanted to know if I could find out anything about your business, your client list, any names you'd mentioned that seemed significant. Evelyn stood up from the kitchen table. She did it slowly, like a person moving through altered gravity. She walked to the window and looked at the dark street and the one car parked under the street lamp that she had started to recognize as Ramirez or whoever Ramirez sent when he wasn't there himself. What did you tell her? She said. Nothing. I told her nothing, Evie. I swear to you, I called her and I said I wasn't going to do that, and she could come after the money through whatever channel she wanted. He was breathing badly now, the breath of a man in his 60s who was ashamed and frightened and trying not to show how much of both. She didn't argue. She just said she was sure I'd reconsider, and then she said... He stopped. Dad. Evelyn pressed her palm flat against the cold window glass. Tell me what she said. She said she already had what she needed anyway. A pause that felt like falling. She said she'd gotten it from someone closer to you than I was. The cold from the glass moved up through Evelyn's hand and into her arm, and somewhere in her chest, and she stood with it and made herself stay very still and think. Someone closer to her. She went through the list. Not clients. She didn't talk about client names casually, and her files were on a laptop that hadn't left the shop. Not her apartment, which held nothing relevant. The shop itself, the consultation area, the workroom. Danny. The woman who had called herself a stylist and sat in the consultation area for 20 minutes with her careful, neutral face and asked questions about mutual contacts and drank Evelyn's tea. Who had arrived the same day that Damien warned her that Vanessa was asking questions. Who had claimed to come from Lena Marchetti. Who had been inside this shop, inside the consultation area, for 20 minutes while Evelyn made tea in the back. She moved fast through the apartment and down the stairs to the shop, not bothering with her coat, and went directly to the consultation area. She looked at the table, the chairs, the small shelf where she kept sample books. She looked at the underside of the table, where a person sitting across from it, reaching down casually to adjust a bag on the floor, might leave something small and flat and easily overlooked. It was there, the size of a thumbnail, matte black, adhered to the inside lip of the table edge. A listening device, the basic kind, cheap enough to be disposable, good enough to catch a room. Evelyn peeled it off with her fingernail. She held it between her thumb and forefinger and looked at it for a very long time. She drove to Damien's office at 9 in the morning without calling first, which she understood was not how people arrived at Damien Vescari's office, and she understood this from the reaction of the man at the front desk of the building on West Wacker, who looked at her with polite alarm and reached for his phone. She put her hand on his desk. "I'm Evelyn Hart," she said. "He knows who I am. Call up and tell him I'm here, and I'll wait exactly 10 minutes. She waited 7. He came down himself, which she hadn't expected, crossed the lobby in 3 strides and looked at her face, and didn't say anything for a moment, which meant he could read something in it that she hadn't finished composing yet. "Come up," he said. The office was on the 14th floor and was nothing like she'd imagined, which annoyed her because she hadn't wanted to have imagined it. It was spare and dark furnished and had windows that looked out at the river, gray-green and cold this morning, moving under a low sky. There were 2 other people in the room when they entered, a woman with close-cropped hair at a desk in the corner, and a man standing near the windows that Evelyn recognized as someone she'd seen near Ramirez. And Damien said, "Give us the room," without looking at either of them, and they left. Evelyn put the listening device on his desk. She watched his face. He picked it up, looked at it. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise and that was not quite anger, but occupied the space where those 2 things met and compressed into something colder and more controlled. "Where?" he said. "Under my consultation table. The woman who called herself Danny. She was in that room for 20 minutes. She kept her voice flat. She came the same day you told me Vanessa was asking questions about me." He was turning the device over in his fingers. Lena doesn't use this hardware. I know. She held his gaze. Which means Danny didn't come from Lena Marchetti. Or if she did, Lena Marchetti is working with someone who uses this hardware. She paused. Who does? He set the device down on the desk. He looked at the window for a moment. There are two people in this city who source this particular model. He said it evenly, like a man reading from a list he'd memorized under different circumstances. One of them works for a real estate consortium that operates out of a building on Clark Street. They handle acquisitions for... He paused, and his jaw tightened slightly. For a family called Crowley. The word landed in the room and sat there. Evelyn looked at him. Vanessa. Vanessa's family has been running surveillance contracts through the consortium for 6 years. He looked back at her. I knew that. I've known it for 3 years. It's one of the reasons I've monitored their activities in certain circles. She heard what was underneath that. You knew Vanessa had surveillance capabilities when you told me she was asking questions about me. Yes, and you didn't tell me that part. He held her gaze. He didn't apologize and didn't look away. I was assessing how far she was willing to go before I gave you information that would change how you moved. The room was very quiet. Outside, the river moved under its gray sky, indifferent. You were managing me, Evelyn said. I was protecting you. Those aren't the same thing. I know. Do you? She moved to the other side of the desk, not to confront him, just to have space between her and the door, to have the full room in front of her. Because I have spent 30 years, my entire adult life, refusing to let people make decisions for me on the grounds that they knew better. My cousin just spent 6 months building a device to listen to my private conversations, and I walked into it partly because you withheld information that might have helped me recognize what was coming. She stopped. I'm not screaming at you. I'm telling you what happened. His face had gone through something while she spoke. Not guilt exactly, but something adjacent. A recognition. He was a man who processed accountability the way he processed everything else, without softening it, without immediately reaching for a counterargument. You're right, he said. I made the wrong call. She had not expected it to come that quickly or that cleanly, and the speed of it disarmed her in a way that being argued with would not have. She breathed out. Vanessa knows about the alley, she said. She has 6 months of my consultation conversations. She knows my client names. She probably knows your name came up in my shop. She paused. My father. She went to my father, Damien. She's holding a debt over him to get information about me. His hands, flat on the desk, went very still. It was the kind of stillness that preceded motion, the compressed stillness of something about to move fast. She didn't get anything from him, Evelyn said quickly. He refused, but she told him she already had what she needed from someone closer to me. She met his eyes. What would she do with 6 months of my conversations? He looked at her steadily. Leverage, evidence of association, something she could take to certain people to make the case that you're not a civilian anymore. A pause. That you're a liability. To you. Or to the people who see me as a problem. Evelyn sat down in the chair across from his desk. She sat down because her legs wanted her to, and she was tired of ignoring what her body was telling her. She sat, and she looked at her hands, and she thought about the $14,000 her father had borrowed, and the $8,000 he'd paid back, and the $6,000 that had been, apparently, a rope around all of them for 2 years without any of them knowing it. She thought about Vanessa's face in the hotel lobby. You look perfect. The weight she'd given to the word perfect, the particular satisfaction in it. She's been planning this since before the gala, Evelyn said. Probably longer. Why? What do I have that's worth this much effort? He was quiet. He sat down across from her on his side of the desk, and she noticed that he didn't lean back. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, which she'd come to understand was how he held himself when something mattered to him. It's not what you have, he said. It's what you are to me. She looked at him. Vanessa Crowley has been trying to get something on me for 2 years, he said. Not criminal. She has too much to lose by going that route. Something personal. Something she could use in a negotiation or leak in a way that shifts how certain people see me. He paused. I don't give people things to use. I don't have personal attachments that are visible. In 8 years, I have not given anyone a lever. He held her gaze. And then I pinned my brooch on a woman in a ballroom and half of Chicago took note. The silence stretched. She set me up, Evelyn said. The gala. The dress. She knew you'd be there. She invited you knowing I would be in that room because she wanted to see how I'd react. She expected you to cry and leave, and she expected me to note it and move on. His jaw tightened. I didn't. Because of the alley. Because of the alley. Because of the way you came back into that room. He paused. Because of other things I'm not going to make a speech about. She looked at him for a long moment, at the broken jaw that had healed slightly wrong, at the eyes that didn't give anything away cheaply, but had, over the last 6 weeks, given her more than she suspected they'd given anyone in a long time. What does she do with what she has? Evelyn said. She takes it to the people who want me reduced, who want to know that Damien Viscari has an exposure, that there's a quiet woman in Logan Square who can make him act outside his own interests. He said it without expression, which was how she knew it cost him something. They won't go after me directly. They'll go after you, and they'll do it in a way that makes it my fault. Evelyn sat with this. She sat with all of it. The device under her table, her father's voice at 7 in the morning, the 6 months of conversations that were now in someone else's hands, the understanding that what she'd thought was a private and careful navigation of something complicated had been visible the entire time to eyes she hadn't known were watching. She had been the most careful person she knew for 30 years. She had been careful and invisible and self-sufficient, and it had not been enough because the moment someone else decided she mattered, the moment Damien Vescari pinned a piece of himself to her dress in a room full of witnesses, she had stopped being able to manage her own invisibility. You couldn't be simultaneously seen by the most dangerous man in Chicago and invisible to the people who wanted to use that against him. She understood that now. What do they want? She said. The people she'd take this to, end state, what do they actually want from you? Territory, he said. There's a corridor of properties running from the South Lakefront to the River District that 5 different interests have been circling for 3 years. I control access to 2 of the key parcels through arrangements that don't appear in any document. A pause. They want me to either move or be moved. And using me is how they move you. It's how they try. She looked at her hands again, the hands that had held him together in a dark alley on a September night, that had fixed a seam under the hands of someone who'd been trying to take something from her since before she knew his name, the hands that had built everything she had, slowly, in a cold shop, by learning to make broken things hold. Then we can't let them, she said. He looked at her. I'm not going to be the thing they used to get to you, she said. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being managed and protected and moved around like a variable in someone else's equation. She met his eyes directly, held them. I need you to tell me everything. Not the managed version, not the protective version. Everything Vanessa has, everyone she's working with, every move that's been made in the last 6 months. She paused. And then we're going to figure out what to do about it together. Not you deciding and telling me the summary. Together. He held her gaze for a long moment. She could see him working through something, calculating the same way she calculated, the way 2 people who had survived difficult things learned to calculate before they committed to anything. Then he reached into his desk drawer and placed a thin folder on the surface between them. This is everything as of this morning, he said. I had it pulled together after the alley incident. I was going to... He stopped. You were going to decide when I was ready for it. He didn't deny it. Yes. She picked up the folder. She opened it and began to read. And she had gotten 4 pages in. 4 pages of names and property records and surveillance logs and a communication thread between Vanessa Crowley and a man named Gerard Holt, who ran the real estate consortium on Clark Street, when she turned the 5th page and found the photograph. It had been taken from a distance, through a long lens, on a night in September. The quality was imperfect but sufficient. A narrow alley, a street lamp at the far end, a dumpster against the left wall. 2 figures, one on the ground, propped against the dumpster, one crouched beside him, head bent over his side. She recognized her own posture before she recognized her face. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in a handwriting she didn't know, September 14th, 11:58 p.m., Logan Square. She looked up at Damien. They had someone in the alley. His face was still. Yes. That night. They had someone watching you that night. I didn't know until 2 weeks ago. She looked at the photograph again, at the two figures in the alley, one broken and one trying to fix it, both of them visible to a lens they hadn't known existed. They've had this for 6 months, she said. Yes, and they waited. She understood it now, the full shape of it, the way the patience of it was almost elegant in its cruelty. They had waited and watched and let Damien make his moves, let him pin the brooch and send the repairs and stand beside her at events, let him demonstrate the attachment clearly enough that there was no ambiguity about what she was to him. And then they'd sent Danny. And then the men in the alley. Not to take her, Ramirez had been right about that, sent to frighten, sent to see how he'd respond. Testing. Measuring. Building a complete map of exactly how far Damien Vescari would go for a quiet woman in Logan Square. And now they had the answer. Gerard Holt, she said. She turned back to the communication thread. He's not working for Vanessa. She's working for him. A pause. A brief, specific pause that told her she'd landed somewhere true. Yes. She kept reading. The communication thread was clinical and operational, the language of people who conducted this kind of exchange regularly and had long since stopped making it personal. She was 4 exchanges from the end of the thread when she hit the line that stopped her cold. She read it twice. She set the page down on the desk. Damien. Her voice came out differently than she intended, lower, stripped of the composure she'd been maintaining. This line. The exchange from 11 days ago. She turned the page toward him and pointed. Is this what I think it is? He looked at the line. His face did something she hadn't seen it do in all the weeks she'd known him. A crack. The briefest and most controlled kind, something that passed through and was gone before she could fully name it. Yes, he said. She sat back in the chair, because the line read, Heart isn't the exposure. Heart is the exit. We use her to get him out of the corridor arrangement voluntarily. Then she becomes... And the message cut off. Incomplete. Either interrupted or intentionally truncated in whatever copy had made it to this folder. Then she becomes what? Evelyn said. He looked at her steadily. We don't know yet. The message was cut before it transmitted completely. We recovered what we could. She looked at him. At his face, which was telling her nothing and everything at the same time, which was doing the thing it did when he was holding something back, not out of manipulation, but out of a need to protect. And she was too tired now to navigate the distance between those two things, and she was done navigating it. Tell me, she said. Not the version where you've decided what I can handle. Tell me what you think the rest of that sentence says. He looked at her for a long moment. The river moved outside the window. Somewhere in the building below them, a door closed. I think it says she becomes expendable, he said. The words sat in the room like something physical. Evelyn breathed in. Breathed out. She looked at the truncated line on the page, and she looked at the man across from her, and she thought about all the things she had been careful about for 30 years, all the small, precise calculations she had made to stay safe, to stay functional, to stay invisible. And she thought about how none of it had mattered because the moment this man had looked at her across a ballroom, she had stopped being invisible to the people who watched him. Then we don't wait for them to finish the sentence, she said. No, he said. We don't. The plan took 4 days to build. She didn't go back to the shop alone. Ramirez was there every morning when she arrived and every evening when she locked up, and she had stopped feeling embarrassed about it because embarrassment was a luxury, and she had suspended several luxuries since the folder on Damien's desk. She worked her normal hours. She finished the Reyes commission, 12 pieces, precise and well-made, delivered on the date she'd promised, because Marcus Reyes had done nothing wrong, and her business was still her business, regardless of everything else happening around it. She talked to her father twice. She did not tell him everything. She told him enough, that she understood what had happened, that it wasn't his fault, that the debt to Vanessa was being handled, and she heard the relief in his voice and the guilt underneath it, and she said, Dad, stop. You were someone's father trying to manage. You didn't know. And he was quiet for a moment and said, You're too much like your mother. And she said, I know, and they both let that sit there, unchallenged. Damien came to the shop every evening around 6. Not to pretend he needed repairs. He came because they were working, because there were things to go through and decisions to make, and because the shop was the one place that felt, to her at least, like ground she understood. He sat in the green chair with the folder or his phone, or sometimes nothing, and they talked, and she learned more about the architecture of his world in 4 days than she had absorbed in 30 years of living adjacent to it. She learned that Gerard Holt had been operating in Chicago for 11 years through a series of holding companies that were, individually, unremarkable. She learned that Vanessa had been on his payroll fisc, not directly, in ways that could not appear in any document, for 4 of those years, which meant the timeline of Vanessa's interest in Evelyn's life predated the gala by 2 years at minimum, and that the particular loan to her father had not been generosity, but an investment, a piece of infrastructure laid in advance against a need that hadn't yet been identified. She learned that the corridor properties Damien controlled were adjacent to a development project worth $340 million, and that the word adjacent was doing a great deal of work, that adjacent meant essential, that without his cooperation the project could not proceed, and that 3 years of Holt's money and planning were frozen in place, waiting for Damien to either move or be moved. She learned that Lena Marchetti was not directly involved with Holt, which meant Danny had either lied about coming from her or Lena had been used as a cover by someone who knew her history with Damien well enough to make the name land correctly. She learned, from a conversation with Damien that was the most careful one they'd had, that his history with Lena was exactly what she had understood it to be. Long, complicated, professional in some periods and personal in others, ended badly enough that her name still did the specific thing it did to his voice when he said it. She did not ask for more than that. She had not earned more than that. What she had earned was this, the plan. It was her idea, which surprised him, she could tell. She'd watched his face when she laid it out, sitting across from him at her cutting table on the 3rd evening with a cup of tea going cold between them. And he'd gone still in the particular way he went still when something realigned his understanding of a situation. "You want to use the gala," he said. "The Wintercrest opens applications for next year's event in 2 weeks. Vanessa will be there because she's been on the planning committee for 3 years. Holt will be there because he's a title sponsor." She kept her voice even. "Every person in this city who matters to this situation will be in one room. And you want to walk in." "I want to walk in and end it." He looked at her. "Evelyn, these are not people who respond to confrontation the way ordinary people do." "I'm not planning a confrontation." She met his eyes. "I'm planning a demonstration." She explained it. All of it. He listened without interrupting, which she'd come to understand was how he listened when he was taking something seriously. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and she watched him work through the angles, the risks, the specific vulnerabilities and advantages of what she was proposing. "You understand," he said carefully, "that if it doesn't work the way you're describing, you become the most visible target in that room. I'm already the most visible target. I've been the most visible target since September." She looked at him. "The difference is that right now they're choosing the terms. I want to choose them." He looked at her for a long moment. "All right. That's it? All right? You've thought it through more carefully than I would have." A pause. "And you're right that it needs to be you. If I move against Holt directly, I become the aggressor. He has lawyers and a narrative ready, but if you—" He stopped. "If I walk into that room on my own 2 feet and say what's true," she said, "then nobody can frame it as Damien Vescari threatening anyone." "Yes," he said. "That's the part I wouldn't have asked you to do." "I know," she said. "That's why I'm the one offering." The night before the gala, she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark of her apartment and stared at the ceiling and ran the plan through her mind the way she ran patterns through her mind before cutting, checking every edge, every seam allowance, every place where 2 pieces of fabric met and had to hold. She had been making things hold together her whole life. She knew how to read the places where structure failed. She got up at 4 and went down to the workroom and turned on the lamp at the cutting table and sat for a while in the quiet. The dress she'd made for tomorrow was hanging on the dress form in the corner. Navy blue wool crepe, simple, structured, with a neckline that was direct without being aggressive. She'd made it in 2 days because she knew how to work fast when she had to. and because making it had given her something to do with her hands during the 4 days of planning when her hands had needed to be doing something. She looked at the dress for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Damien. He answered on the first ring. She understood from that he wasn't sleeping either. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to answer it straight, not managed." "Ask." "Is there any part of this plan that requires something bad to happen to me for it to work? Any version of this where I'm better to you as a victim than as whatever I am when I'm standing on my own?" A silence, long enough that she sat with the full weight of having asked it. "No," he said. "If anything happens to you in that room, the plan fails, because the plan depends on you walking out the other side intact and on your own terms." A pause. "And because I'm not built to function with something happening to you. I've tried to be honest with myself about that." She breathed out. "Okay. Okay? I just needed to know." A silence between them that was not uncomfortable. "Evelyn, you don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," she said. "Not for you. I need to do this for me. I need to be the person who walked into that room, not the person who was protected from it." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "Then stop trying to talk me out of it." "I'm not trying to talk you out of it. You're doing the voice." A pause. "What voice?" "The voice where you are choosing each word carefully so I can't see what you're thinking." She looked at the dress on the form. "Just talk to me like a person." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in the quality of his voice changed, relaxed fractionally, became the version of his voice that she'd heard a few times in the green chair late in the evening when he'd stopped performing the careful version of himself. "I'm scared," he said. "I don't say that. I don't have a lot of practice with it, but that's what it is." She sat with it. "Me too," she said. They stayed on the line for a while without talking, and eventually she went back upstairs and lay down in the dark. And this time, sometime before the sky started to pale at the window, she slept. The Castellan Hotel looked the same. Of course it did. It was stone and iron and brass, and it had been standing since 1921, and it was not going to look different because Evelyn Hart was approaching it with her shoulders back and a navy dress under her coat and her hair done by someone who knew what they were doing, which she had allowed Damien's assistant Clara to arrange because she was practical and she had larger things to be rigid about. Ramirez was in a car at the corner. 3 other people she'd learned to recognize over the past week were distributed in ways she couldn't see but knew were there. The plan was in motion in other directions too. Damien had made calls, called in things she didn't have the vocabulary for yet, arrangements she understood in outline and trusted in specificity. She pushed through the brass door alone. The lobby was the same, the marble, the warm light, the particular hum of a full event building toward its own momentum. She checked her coat. She straightened the dress. She walked toward the ballroom, and she didn't look at anything but where she was going. Vanessa found her before she'd been in the room 4 minutes. She appeared at Evelyn's shoulder with a champagne flute and a smile that was so perfectly calibrated that anyone watching would have seen warmth. "Evie? I didn't know you were coming." "I know you didn't." Evelyn kept her voice level. "We need to talk." A flicker, brief. "Of course. Let me just... Now, Vanessa." She said it quietly. The way she said things she meant. Vanessa looked at her for a moment, and Evelyn watched her cousin recalculate, reread her, update whatever model she'd been running of Evelyn Hart, the soft-spoken seamstress who lowered her eyes, and find that the update didn't quite fit the model. They moved to a quieter edge of the room, near a service corridor that Evelyn had noted when she'd walked in. Vanessa held her champagne with both hands and waited, and there was something behind her performance now, something that was not quite worry, but was in the neighborhood of it. "I know about Holt," Evelyn said. "I know about the consortium. I know about the loan to my father and what you asked him to do for it." She kept her eyes on Vanessa's face. "I know about Danny and what she left under my table." Vanessa's expression did not crack. It was remarkable, actually, a kind of professional-grade composure that Evelyn had not fully credited her with before. "Evie, I don't know what you think you've—" "I have the communications," Evelyn said, "between you and Holt. I have 11 months of them." A silence. Something moved across Vanessa's face that was too fast to name. "You have She stopped. That's not possible. A lot of things that happened in the last 6 months weren't supposed to be possible. Evelyn held her gaze. You made a mistake. You assumed that because I was quiet, I was without resources. You assumed that the only resource I'd found was Damien's protection. You didn't account for the possibility that I was learning. Vanessa's hands tightened on the champagne flute. The composure was still there, but it was working harder now, visibly, like a seam under stress. What do you want? I want you to walk with me to where Gerard Holt is standing, Evelyn said, and I want you to tell him that the arrangement is done, that the corridor deal is off, that whatever leverage you thought you had over Damien through me has been removed. And if I don't? Evelyn looked at her cousin, at the face she'd known since childhood, the face that had been calculating something for as long as she could remember, and she felt none of the things she might have expected to feel. Not anger, not satisfaction, something simpler and colder. Then the communications go to the 3 journalists I've already been in contact with, and they go to the 2 federal contacts that Damien's attorney has been briefed on, and they go to the 4 members of the Wintercrest Planning Committee who are in this room tonight, and who have been on Holt's donor list for 2 years. She paused. And they go to your mother, who I don't believe knows the specifics of how her family's money has been used. Vanessa stared at her. You turned my dress into a weapon, Evelyn said. You used my father's need against him. You put a device in my shop and you hired people to stand in my alley in the dark, and you sat across from me at a party and laughed when I was humiliated. She held Vanessa's gaze without flinching. I'm not doing this because I hate you. I'm doing this because I refuse to be something you can move around. A long silence. Vanessa looked past Evelyn toward the room, toward where Holt was standing near the far bar, silver-haired, talking to 2 men who both stood, the way men stood when they were listening to someone who held their salary. She looked at him, and then she looked back at Evelyn. He's not going to take this well, she said. It was not a threat. It was something closer to a warning, the first honest thing she'd said. I know, Evelyn said. He has people here. So do I. Vanessa looked at her for another moment. Something passed across her face that Evelyn had never seen on it before. Not in 30 years of knowing this woman. Not once. She couldn't name it completely. It was something adjacent to respect, perhaps, or something adjacent to the recognition of having miscalculated badly enough that the calculation couldn't be recovered. All right, Vanessa said. They walked across the room together. Holt saw them coming from 8 feet away, and he read the situation, or tried to, before they arrived. He was good at reading rooms. He'd built his career on it. He saw Vanessa's face and the tightness around her eyes, and he saw the woman beside her that he knew from photographs but had never spoken to. And something in his expression closed down and reconfigured into the polished blankness of a man who had faced difficult conversations before and knew how to manage them. He dismissed the 2 men with a slight movement of his head. They moved off. Miss Hart, he said. I don't believe we've been introduced. No, Evelyn said. We haven't. He looked at Vanessa. Is there a problem? Vanessa said nothing. She was looking at the floor near his feet, and Evelyn understood that for all of Vanessa's capacity and planning and patient cruelty, she was afraid of this man, had been afraid of him for 4 years probably, had been operating in his orbit for so long that the fear had become infrastructure, something she built everything else on top of. There's a situation, Evelyn said, and she felt her own heartbeat in her throat, felt her hands very precisely and consciously at her sides, felt the specific quality of the 200 people in the room behind her, none of whom knew what was happening 6 feet from the East Bar. One I think you'd prefer to resolve quietly. Holt looked at her. His eyes were light blue and very still, and assessed her the way she was used to being assessed in rooms like this. By type, by category, by apparent leverage. He was running the numbers. She could watch him do it. I've been told you're a seamstress, he said. It was not a compliment and not an insult. It was a placement. I am, she said, and I've spent my life learning how things are constructed, what holds and what doesn't, where the structural failure starts. She held his gaze. Your arrangement with Vanessa's family is structurally failed. The communications that document it are no longer exclusively in your possession. What you do in the next 10 minutes determines how many people they reach. His face didn't change. That was the thing about men like Holt. The face was a separate instrument from everything happening underneath it. What do you want? The corridor project ends. The properties remain as they are. No further contact with my family, my clients, or my business. She paused. And you leave Chicago by the end of the month. Something moved in his eyes. Not fear. She didn't think it was fear. Not yet. Calculation. Still, rapid and precise. He was measuring her, measuring Vanessa's silence beside her, measuring whatever he could read in the room around them. You're making a significant claim, he said, for someone with no standing in this conversation. My standing, she said, is that I have what I have and I'm the one standing in front of you. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, without warning, without any change in his expression that she could have predicted, he looked past her, toward the center of the room, and something shifted in his face. She turned. Damien was there. He had come in while she was talking, had crossed the room with that particular economy of movement that she knew now, and he was standing 15 feet away with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes on Holt. And he was not doing anything dramatic, was not moving toward them, was simply present in the room the way a weather system was present, as something that did not need to announce itself because its arrival was its own announcement. Holt looked at him. Damien looked at Holt. The two men with Holt, who had moved off but not far, had both registered Damien's presence and were looking at each other with the careful look of men reassessing a situation they thought they'd already mapped. Evelyn had not told Damien to come. She had told him, explicitly, that she wanted to do this herself. He had said all right. He had said it in the voice that she'd learned, and she had trusted it. And now he was standing in the room, and she felt the anger of it move through her fast and clean. And underneath the anger, something that was not anger at all, something that she did not have time to examine right now. She looked back at Holt. His calculation had changed. She could see it. The specific reconfiguration of a man who had entered a conversation with one set of odds and was now working with a different set. He looked at Evelyn, and then at Damien, and back at Evelyn, and she saw him update his model of what she was, of what she represented, of whether the woman standing in front of him was a civilian and over her head or something else. You planned this together, he said. I planned this, she said. He's here because... She stopped. Because she didn't know why he was here, because he'd come anyway. Because he had said all right in that particular voice, and then come anyway, and she was going to have words about that, but not right now. Not in front of Gerard Holt in the east end of the Castellan Hotel ballroom, with 200 people behind them, and the plan suspended at exactly the point where it either held or it didn't. She looked at Holt. Because it's over, she said. However you want to characterize the rest of it, that part is over. You can end this cleanly, or you can end this in print. Those are the options. She held his gaze. I'm a seamstress. I know when a seam is past saving. This one is? Holt looked at her. He looked at Vanessa, who was still looking at the floor. He looked past Evelyn at Damien, who had not moved, who was standing with his hands at his sides and his eyes on Holt, with the quality of attention that did not need to become anything else to be understood clearly. And then Holt looked back at Evelyn, and something in his face moved, some final piece of the calculation completed, and he said, in a voice that was completely level and completely empty of anything that could be called concession or defeat, I'll need 3 days. You have one, she said. A pause. 2. She held his gaze. Done. He picked up his drink from the bar behind him, turned, and walked away. Not fast. Not slowly. The walk of a man who was leaving on his own terms, even when he was not. The two men near the edge of the room followed him at a distance. Vanessa exhaled. It was the smallest sound, barely audible, the sound of something that had been held for a very long time, releasing without permission. She didn't look at Evelyn. She set her champagne flute on the nearest surface and walked in the opposite direction from Holt toward the far end of the room. And Evelyn watched her go and felt the particular exhaustion of a confrontation that had gone right and left her empty rather than relieved. She turned around. Damien was still standing where he'd been. Closer now. The 15 feet had reduced to 5 while she wasn't measuring it. He was looking at her with the steady, unreadable look that she had, over 6 weeks, begun to read with some accuracy. I told you I was doing this alone, she said. Yes, he said. You came anyway. Yes. She looked at him. Her heart was still running fast, the adrenaline of the last 4 minutes still burning through her in a way that made her hands want to shake, which she was not going to allow them to do. Why? He held her gaze. Because I told you I'd changed, he said, And I came here with every intention of staying in the car. And I stayed in the car for 6 minutes, and then I came inside anyway. And I know that's not what you wanted, and I know what it looks like." He paused. "I'm not going to dress it up. I couldn't stay in the car." She looked at him for a long moment, at the broken jaw and the still, careful eyes, and the man who had been trying, she believed, with everything that was honest in him, to be different than he was built to be, and had failed at the specific moment when it cost him most to fail. "We need to talk about that," she said. "I know. Not here. No." She looked at the room, at the 200 people who had not heard a word of what had happened in the last 10 minutes, the oblivious machinery of the Wintercrest Gala continuing to turn around them, champagne and conversation and string quartet, and the specific orchestrated social performance of Chicago money spending an evening with itself. She looked at the bar where Holt had stood. She looked at the direction Vanessa had walked. She looked at Damien. "There's one more thing I need to do first," she said. He waited. She turned and walked toward the center of the room, toward the cluster of people that included the silver-haired woman named Helena Marsh, who was on the Arts Council Acquisition Committee and who had watched Evelyn's dress fail 4 weeks ago with the expression of someone who did not intend to involve themselves. Toward Petra and Margot, who were standing near the floral arrangement talking to 2 men in dark suits. Toward the center of the same room that had watched her hold her dress closed and flush with humiliation and walk away. She had not raised her voice in the East End of the Castellan Hotel with Gerard Holt. She had not performed. She had not made a scene. She had simply said what was true, quietly and with precision, and waited for it to land. She intended to do the same thing here. Helena Marsh turned as she approached, and recognition moved across her face, and Evelyn saw the subtle social readjustment, the recalibration of what category to place this woman in, given that she had arrived beside Damien Viscari and walked the room with his attention tracking her and had apparently just concluded a private conversation with Gerard Holt that had resulted in Holt leaving the bar. "Miss Hart," Helena said. There was a question in it. "Mrs. Marsh." Evelyn stopped in front of her, steady, unhurried. "We met briefly at the last event. I wanted to introduce myself properly. I design and produce custom clothing, evening wear, tailored professional pieces. I have several clients on the Arts Council already." She met Helena's eyes directly. "I think my work would be relevant to the committee's wardrobe needs for next season's events." Helena looked at her. "I remember you," she said. "From last time." "I know," Evelyn said, a beat. Helena looked at Evelyn, at the navy dress, the composed face, the hands that were not shaking. And then she said, "Could you send me a portfolio? I'd like to see your range." "Absolutely," Evelyn said. She produced a card from the small clutch she carried, the card she'd printed 2 days ago in anticipation of this specific moment. She held it out, and Helena Marsh took it. Petra had turned from her conversation and was watching them. Margot, too. Evelyn looked at both of them, briefly and without expression, and then she turned and walked back across the room. Damien fell into step beside her as she reached the edge of the crowd. They walked toward the lobby together in silence, and the room moved around them. The conversation, and the music, and the particular warm noise of a gathering that would never know how much had just changed in its margins. And Evelyn kept her spine straight and her chin level and did not look at anyone except the door. In the lobby, she stopped. She turned to face him. He was watching her with the full weight of his attention, the kind that made you feel very specifically seen, and was simultaneously the most and least comfortable thing she'd experienced in her life. There was something on his face that she hadn't seen there before or hadn't let herself name, something that sat beyond the careful management, beyond the economy, and the control, something that was not dressed up or strategic or withheld. "You stayed in the car for 6 minutes," she said. "Yes." "And then you came in." "Yes." She looked at him. "Damien." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, without performance, without the weight of what it was supposed to mean to the rest of Chicago. Just his name. "If we're going to—" She stopped, started again. "If this is what I think it is, I need to know that you understand what I told you in your office, about decisions, about not being managed." "I understand it," he said. "I failed it tonight." "Yes," she said. "You did. I know." And I need to know whether that's who you are, she said, or whether that's who you've been and you're trying to change it. He held her gaze. The lobby moved around them, guests coming and going, the revolving brass door turning, the particular indifferent efficiency of a hotel that had been processing human drama for 100 years. I don't know yet, he said. I think that's the most honest answer I can give you. She breathed out. That's not the answer I wanted. I know, he said, but it's the true one. A pause. You walked into that room tonight and you handled something that I've been managing, badly, by my own admission, for 3 years. You did it without asking for anything from me except information. You did it your way. Something moved through his expression. And I still couldn't stay in the car. She looked at him for a long moment. The lobby, the brass door turning, the sound of the city outside, Chicago in January, cold and unromantic and entirely itself. That's the thing we need to fix, she said. Yes, he said. Whether we can fix it is what determines everything else. He held her gaze. I know that too. She looked at him. At the man who had been trying to hold things together his own way for so long that he wasn't sure anymore where the holding ended and the controlling began. At the man who had come into her shop with a jacket that didn't need fixing and sat in her green chair and listened, actually listened, and still could not make himself stay in the car when it mattered. She understood it. That was the problem. She understood it the way she understood every structural failure. Not with forgiveness, exactly, but with the knowledge of where the flaw lived and what it would take to repair it, and whether the material was worth the work. The front door of the Castellan opened and the cold came in, and somewhere in the building behind them the gala was still running, the music still playing, and Gerard Holt was sitting in a car on Michigan Avenue recalculating something that had already been decided. And Vanessa Crowley was in a bathroom on the second floor, crying the specific tears of someone who had bet on the wrong version of a person. And in a workroom in Logan Square, there was a dress form wearing nothing, because the dress this form had been wearing was now on the body of a woman standing in a hotel lobby looking at a man who had come in from the cold when she'd asked him to stay outside, and she was deciding something. She decided it. Come to the shop tomorrow, she said. Not to fix something, not with a reason, just come. He looked at her. All right. And we're going to talk, the real version. Yes, he said. She nodded once. She turned and walked through the brass door into the Chicago cold, and she did not look back, and the door turned behind her, and the city received her the way it always had. Without ceremony, without acknowledgement, with the complete indifference of a place that had been here long before her and would be here long after, and which did not particularly care what she had just survived. She pulled her coat tighter and walked toward the car that was waiting at the corner, and she breathed the cold air in and let it move through her, and she thought about nothing except her feet on the pavement and the next step and the one after that, which was all she had ever really needed to think about. One step, then the next. She was good at that. The 2 days that followed the gala were the quietest Evelyn had known since September. Not peaceful. Quiet was not the same as peaceful, and she had lived long enough to know the difference. It was the quiet of aftermath, of a storm that had moved through and left the air changed, the particular silence of spaces that had been loud and were now letting themselves breathe. She went to the shop. She worked. She finished a set of alterations for a client she'd been putting off, and she started the preliminary measurements for the Reyes overflow. Marcus had referred 2 colleagues, which meant the commission had grown in scope, and she needed to hire someone to help with the cutting. She called 3 people whose work she'd seen and respected. She made appointments. She did not call Damien. He had come to the shop the morning after the gala, as she'd asked, at 9:15, and they had talked for 3 hours at the cutting table with coffee that went cold between them and the morning light changing on the workroom floor. It had been the hardest conversation she'd had with him, harder than the folder on the desk, harder than anything, because it required her to say out loud the things she'd been carrying carefully in silence, and it required him to do the same, and neither of them was built for that, which meant they were both bad at it in ways that were sometimes infuriating and sometimes recognizable and occasionally, unexpectedly, something close to funny. She had told him about the car, not just the fact of it, that he'd come in when she'd asked him to stay out, but what it meant to her, what it triggered in the specific internal architecture of a woman who had spent 30 years managing the weight of other people's decisions about her life. She said it clearly, and without softening it, because she had decided that if this was worth anything, it was worth the discomfort of honesty. He had listened, all the way through. He had not argued or explained or reframed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I've spent 8 years being the person who makes the final call, on everything, because the alternative, in my world, was having the call made wrong by someone who didn't understand the stakes. I don't know how to turn that off. I don't know if I can turn it off. But I know that what I did last night was wrong." He paused. "Not tactically. Wrong for you. And those are different." She had looked at him. "Yes," she said. "They are." "I'm going to do it again," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I'm going to feel the impulse, and sometimes I'm going to act on it before I've thought it through. I don't think I can promise you I won't." "Then what can you promise me?" He held her gaze. "That I'll tell you when I do. That I won't dress it up or manage the framing. That I'll come back every time and say, 'I did this thing and it was wrong,' and let you decide what that's worth." She sat with that for a long moment, with the particular weight of a promise that was not everything she wanted and was also, she recognized, more honest than most promises she'd been given in her life. "That's enough to work with," she said finally. "Is it?" "I said it's enough to work with. I didn't say it was enough." She looked at the cooling coffee. "It means we're not done. It means we keep going and we see what we build." He was quiet. "All right. And Damien," she met his eyes, "the next time you feel the impulse to come through a door, I've asked you to stay outside of. I want you to wait 60 seconds. Not 6 minutes, just 60 seconds. And ask yourself whether you're coming in for me or for you." He held her gaze. Something moved through his expression, and she watched it move, and she saw that the question had landed somewhere real. 60 seconds, he said. "Yes. I can do 60 seconds. She picked up her coffee and found it cold and drank it anyway. "Good," she said. "Now let me tell you about the Reyes overflow because I need to hire someone and I want your opinion on the liability structure of bringing on a part-time cutter." He looked at her for a moment with something that was, she was fairly certain, the closest thing to startled she had ever seen on his face. Then it settled into something warmer and more ordinary. "I don't know anything about hiring cutters." "I know, but you know about liability structures." "That's true." "Then be useful," she said, and reached for a pad of paper, and the morning moved on. Get. The news about Gerard Holt came on a Thursday, 11 days after the gala. It came through Damien's attorney first, in the form of a brief message that Clara relayed to Evelyn's phone at 8 in the morning. The corridor project had been formally withdrawn from the City Development Registry. 3 of the holding companies under the consortium umbrella had filed dissolution paperwork. Holt had closed his Chicago office and relocated, destination not publicly recorded. He had taken his 2 days and used them, and whatever else he had decided about Evelyn Hart and Damien Vescari and the cost-benefit of continuing to operate in a city where the calculation had shifted, he had decided quietly and without drama, which was the only kind of exit a man like Holt could afford. Evelyn read the message while she was opening the shop and then put her phone in her pocket and unlocked the front door and turned on the lights. She stood in the middle of her workroom in the morning, quiet, and breathed. The fabric was on the shelves where it always was. The thread was organized by color the way she'd organized it for 4 years. The dress form in the corner wore the muslin toile she'd started for a new commission yesterday, rough-pinned and unfinished, waiting for her hands. The smell of the shop was the smell of her life, clean fabric and machine oil, and the faint chemical note of the iron that she always forgot to unplug at night. She went to the iron and unplugged it. She started work. "Basima." Vanessa called at noon. Evelyn looked at the name on her phone screen for a long moment, and then she answered because she had spent her whole life making herself do the difficult thing rather than the comfortable thing, and she was not going to stop now. "I'm not going to apologize," Vanessa said. Her voice was different than Evelyn had ever heard it, stripped of the warm, performed register she used in public, without the careful architecture of a woman managing her reception in every room. She sounded tired. She sounded, more than that, like someone who had reached the end of a long effort and found nothing on the other side of it worth the cost. "I don't think it would mean anything, and I don't think you'd want it." "No," Evelyn said. "What I'm going to say is that I underestimated you. From the beginning. I built the whole thing on the assumption that you were the version of yourself I'd always seen, and I didn't update the model when I should have. A pause. That was a professional mistake as much as anything. Evelyn held the phone and looked at the muslin toile on the dress form. Why did you need me specifically? Holt had resources. He had better leverage than a loan to my father and a device under a table. A silence. Long enough that she thought Vanessa might not answer. Because Vescari doesn't react to threats, Vanessa said finally. Direct pressure, legal exposure, financial, none of it moves him. He's been through all of it and he doesn't move. Another pause. But you're not a threat. You're something he chose. The theory was that something he chose could be used in ways that a threat couldn't. Because a threat he can manage, Evelyn said. But something he cares about, he can't always think clearly around. Yes, she breathed out. And now Holt is gone and I have to figure out what I am without the arrangement. Vanessa's voice was flat, not broken. Vanessa was too constructed to sound broken, even now, but stripped of its forward momentum, the momentum of a woman who had always known what she was working toward and no longer did. The family will manage. They always do. I'll manage. Vanessa. Evelyn said her cousin's name the way she said things she meant. The loan. The $6,000 my father still owes. A pause. What about it? I'm going to pay it. Not to you. I'll wire it to whatever account you direct me to, and you're going to send a written confirmation to my father that the debt is settled and there are no further obligations. She kept her voice even. And then we're going to not speak for a while. I don't know how long. Vanessa was quiet. And after the while? I don't know yet, was the honest answer. You're my family. That's a fact. What it means is something I need time to figure out. Another silence. All right, Vanessa said. She said it the way people said things when they were out of arguments, when they had reached the place where the only thing left was acceptance. And Evelyn recognized it because she had been in that place herself, more than once, and she knew what it cost. Vanessa, she paused. I'm not the person you built your plan around. I haven't been for a while. I think you know that. A long silence. I know, Vanessa said. I knew it that night in the lobby when you came back into the ballroom. A pause that felt like something being set down. I just didn't adjust. They said goodbye without warmth and without performance, which was the most honest goodbye they'd exchanged in 30 years. Evelyn hung up and stood at the cutting table and was quiet for a moment. Then she picked up the muslin toile from the dress form and got to work. The $6,000 went out of her account 3 days later. The confirmation came to her father's email the same afternoon. She had asked for it to come to him directly, and it did, and he called her that evening and was quiet on the phone in the way he was quiet when he was trying not to make the emotion bigger than it needed to be. You didn't have to do that, he said. Yes, I did, she said. You would have carried it. Evie, Dad. She sat in this kitchen with her tea. You built something for me. For 20 years you kept the lights on and you got up every morning and you didn't complain and you didn't ask me to carry more than I could. I can pay $6,000. She paused. Let me. He was quiet for a long time. You're too much like your mother, he said. You keep saying that. It keeps being true. She smiled alone in her kitchen in the way you smiled at things that were simultaneously painful and exactly right. How's the building? He talked for 20 minutes about the maintenance work. A heating system on the 7th floor that had been bypassed incorrectly for 3 years and was now finally done right. A lobby renovation the management was considering. A tenant on the 4th floor who kept jamming the freight elevator. He talked the way he always talked about work he found meaningful, with detail, with humor, with the particular satisfaction of someone who fixed things for a living and found dignity in the fixing. She listened, all the way through. She did not check her phone or make notes or do anything except sit with her tea and listen to her father talk about work he was good at. When he finally wound down, she said, I love you, Dad. He said, I know. I love you too. And then, after a pause, this man, Vescari. She waited. He's not a simple thing to be involved with. No, she said. You know what he is. Yes. And I'm thinking clearly, she said. I'm not mistaking the difficulty of it for a reason to stop. I'm not pretending it's simple. A pause. He's not simple. Neither am I. We're figuring out if that's workable. Her father was quiet. Your mother had a phrase for this kind of thing. I know. You've told me. Tell me you remember it. She smiled again. She said the only question that matters is whether the person makes you more yourself or less. Yes. A pause. Does he? She thought about it. About the cutting table and the cold coffee and 60 seconds and the folder on the desk and the green chair and the alley in September and the man who had looked at her through the glass of a lobby door and recalibrated everything he'd understood about the night. More, she said. I think more. It's early. Early is fine, her father said. Early means there's still time to find out. March came to Chicago the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits, with days of almost warmth followed by hard freezes that reminded you the city gave nothing easily. Evelyn hired the cutter, a young woman named Priya who was fast and precise and had a good eye for grain, and the shop expanded its hours. The Reyes commission completed and was delivered, and Marcus Reyes wore the first suit to a board meeting and sent a photograph and a note that said simply, exactly right, which was the best feedback she had ever received. The theater company signed a 2-year contract. Helena Marsh sent a portfolio request, followed by an appointment that resulted in evening wear commissions for 3 foundation board members. The shop was not rescued. It was not transformed overnight into something it hadn't been. It was still the same cold in winter, cramped, imperfectly lit space above a street in Logan Square where the foot traffic was unpredictable and the parking was a problem. But it was full. It was consistently, credibly full in the way that came from work, and not from anyone's arrangement. And Evelyn knew the difference, and the difference mattered to her more than the fullness. Damien was there on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually in the evenings. He had stopped pretending to need repairs. He brought food sometimes, from a Thai place 3 blocks away that he'd found by asking Ramirez, who apparently had opinions about Thai food, and they ate at the cutting table and talked about things that were not always the architecture of his world or the development of her business. He had started asking about the work itself, about what made a well-constructed garment different from a fast one, about the decisions that happened at the cutting stage that couldn't be corrected later, about grain and drape and the specific vocabulary of someone who made things with their hands. She discovered that he actually wanted to know, that the questions were not performance or social lubricant, but genuine curiosity, the kind that came from a mind that found systems interesting regardless of the category they occupied. She discovered, teaching him, that she had never been asked these questions by someone who listened to the answers, and that being listened to in this specific way was something she had not known she was missing. He was late once, on a Thursday in mid-February, and called to tell her so. Just called directly, without a relay through Clara, to say the meeting was running over and he'd be an hour behind. It was such a small thing. She thought about it afterward, the smallness of it, the fact that it was the kind of thing people who were trying to be considered did, automatically, without calculation. She had asked him once whether the 60 seconds helped. He had looked at her for a moment. It helps me identify the impulse, he said. Whether I act on the impulse or not is still a work in progress. That's honest. I told you I would be. You also told me you'd fail sometimes. Yes. A pause. Have I? She thought about it carefully, which he waited for, which was itself a kind of answer. Not since the gala, she said, but I think that's partly because nothing has tested it since the gala. Probably, he said. So we wait for the test. So we wait for the test, he agreed. They had waited, and the test had come in smaller forms. Decisions about the business where he'd had opinions and offered them and stopped there, where she'd taken what was useful and set aside what wasn't, and he'd let her. Moments where she could see him catch something and hold it and redirect. 60 seconds, internalized, becoming something that operated below the surface. Not fixed. She was not going to use that word, but changing. And change, in her experience, was the most honest thing a person could offer. It was a Sunday in late March when she finally understood something she'd been carrying without a name for 6 months. She had gone to her father's apartment for the first time since he'd started the new job. The first time she'd been inside the apartment he'd been renting for 2 years. A clean 3-room place in a building he actually liked. He'd made the specific meal he always made when she came, a long simmered thing with rice that he'd learned from her mother and had never stopped making, that smelled like every significant Sunday of her childhood. They'd eaten at his kitchen table and talked, and she'd helped him wash the dishes afterward, both of them at the sink the way they'd always been. Her drying, him washing, without discussing the arrangement. Walking home through the cold that was finally, grudgingly, beginning to soften, she had thought about the shape of the last 6 months, about the winter crest and the dress and the alley and the folder on the desk, and everything that had moved and shifted and been broken and repaired and broken differently and slowly, imperfectly, held together in new configurations. She had spent 30 years building a life organized around not needing anything from anyone, around managing the cost of existence so precisely that she never ran a deficit, around making herself small enough, careful enough, invisible enough that no one could use her need against her. And then a man had seen her in an alley in September, and the whole structure had been tested in a way she hadn't anticipated because the test wasn't an attack. She knew how to handle attacks. She'd been handling them since she was 8 years old and learned what Vanessa's warmth cost. The test was someone deciding she mattered when she hadn't asked them to, and the mattering changing the map of everything she'd drawn. She had thought the danger was losing herself in the mattering, in becoming something defined by someone else's attention. She understood now, walking home on a late March Sunday with her hands in her pockets and the air carrying the first ambiguous warmth of a season that hadn't quite committed, that she had it backwards. She had not become less herself. She had become more visible to herself. Because Damien Viscari had looked at her without the filter she'd trained every other person in her life to see through, had looked at her and not the managed version of her, and the looking had forced her, slowly, to look back, to see the woman who came back into the ballroom, who said we're even and meant it, who read the seam and knew it was cut, who sat across from Gerard Holt in the East End of the Castellan and said, "You have one day," without her voice shaking, who paid the $6,000 and told her father to let her. She had been building that woman for 30 years and had not quite known she was doing it. She stopped on the sidewalk half a block from the shop and stood still for a moment in the late afternoon light, the city moving around her with its ordinary Sunday pace, a woman with a dog going past, a kid on a bike, a car with music she couldn't identify coming from the open window. She stood in the middle of it and felt the specific quality of her own life, the texture of it, the weight and the color and the noise of it, and she did not evaluate or calculate or measure the cost of anything. She just stood there. It was the first time in 30 years she had done that. After a moment, she started walking again, toward the shop, toward the light she could see in the window because she'd left it on when she'd gone out this morning, the small yellow rectangle of it against the early evening dark. He was there when she came in. Not in the shop. He had a key now, which they had discussed carefully and agreed on specific terms about, and he was in the kitchen upstairs, which was where she found him when she climbed the stairs. He had clearly been there for a while, long enough to have made some determination about what was in her refrigerator, and decided, apparently, that the answer was insufficient, because there was a bag on the counter from the market 2 streets over, and a pan on the stove with something in it that smelled like actual food rather than the toast she usually managed on Sunday evenings. He looked up when she came through the door. He was not in his coat. His coat was on the chair, jacket too, sleeves rolled back, which was a version of him she'd seen a few times and still registered as slightly surprising. The difference between the man in the ballroom and the man at her kitchen stove. "You were at your father's," he said. Not a question. "Yes." She set her bag down. "How long have you been here?" "Hour." The soup needed time. He looked at the pan. "I don't actually know how to make soup. I followed a website." She looked at the pan, at the approximation of something that was not quite soup, but was making a creditable effort. Did the website help? It gave me instructions. Whether I followed them correctly is unclear. She came and stood beside him at the stove and looked at the soup. It was not wrong, exactly. It was the product of someone who understood the concept of soup, but had not made it enough times to have developed a feel for it. She picked up the wooden spoon he'd left on the rest and stirred it once and tasted it. "It needs salt," she said. "I thought it might." She reached past him for the salt and added some and stirred it again and tasted again. "Better. It needs another 10 minutes." "All right." She put the spoon down and stood at the stove with him in the small kitchen with the window going dark at the end of the day, and the smell of the soup, and the particular domestic normalcy of a Sunday evening that she had not, she realized, allowed herself to have in a very long time. "How's your father?" he asked. "Good. He's good." She turned to lean against the counter so she was facing the kitchen rather than the stove. "He asked about you." "What did you tell him?" "That we're figuring out if it's workable." She met his eyes. He thought that was a reasonable answer. Damien looked at her. His face in the kitchen light was different than his face in the office. Different than the face in the ballroom, or at the cutting table, or in any of the places where he was wearing the version of himself that the world expected. In the kitchen, in the ordinary evening light, he looked like what he was. A man in his 40s who had carried significant weight for a long time and had set enough of it down recently that the difference was visible in the line of his shoulders. "Is it?" he said. "Workable." She thought about the 60 seconds, about the folder on the desk and the honest version of "I was managing you and I was wrong," about the Tuesday evenings and the Thai food, and the questions about grain and drape, about the phone call that said, "I'm going to be an hour late," in the way of someone who'd decided that small considerations were worth making, about the soup, imperfect, and made from a website, sitting on her stove on a Sunday evening. "Yes," she said. "I think so." He held her gaze for a moment. "You think, or you know?" "I know." She paused. "I just said think because I'm still getting used to saying things I know." Something crossed his face. Not the near smile that she'd catalogued early in the winter, but the real version, the one she'd seen maybe 4 times, that made him look younger and less constructed and entirely himself. "I'm familiar with that problem," he said. "I know you are." She turned back to the stove and stirred the soup again, and it was ready, or ready enough. And she got 2 bowls from the cabinet, and he carried them to the table, and she brought the pot. And they sat down across from each other at the kitchen table, the way 2 people sat when they had stopped performing anything for each other and were simply there. The soup was imperfect. The salt helped but couldn't compensate for a heavier hand needed on the aromatics, and the vegetables were a few minutes past where they should have been, and she ate it all and it tasted like a Sunday evening in her kitchen with the window gone fully dark now and the city quiet outside. "Next time I'll make it," she said. "I'll watch how it's done. It's not complicated." "Most things aren't," he said. "When you know what you're doing." She looked at him across the table, at the broken jaw and the still eyes and the man who had been trying, with varying degrees of success, to be better than his own architecture for 6 months. At the specific quality of his attention, which had not diminished, which was, she thought, one of the things she trusted most about him, that his attention did not diminish, that he did not become less interested as the newness wore off, that he was present in the room she was actually in, and not a room he was imagining. "Damien," she said. "Yes. I'm not going to be easy. I know. I'm going to push back on things. I'm going to tell you when you're wrong. I'm going to need you to—" "Evelyn." His voice was quiet. "I know." She held his gaze. "I just want to make sure you know what you're getting." He looked at her steadily. "I know what I'm getting," he said. "I've known since the alley. I just needed to get to where I was willing to say it out loud." She sat with that. With the specific weight of it, the honesty in it, the admission underneath it of a man who had known something for 6 months and had been working, slowly and imperfectly, toward the willingness to say it. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" "I said okay." She picked up her spoon. "Eat your soup." He ate his soup. She ate hers. Outside the window, the city continued its Sunday evening, indifferent and enormous and entirely unconcerned with what 2 people were building at a kitchen table in Logan Square, which was exactly as it should be, because what they were building was not for the city, was not for the Castellan Hotel, or the Wintercrest Gala, or the Corridor properties, or any of the things that had brought them to this table. It was for themselves, which was the only reason anything built to last ever got built. The shop opened Monday morning at 9, as it always did, and Priya came in at 9:15, and they worked through the morning on the new commissions, the room full of the ordinary sounds of work, the machine, the iron, the quiet talk of 2 people who understood each other's process. At lunch, Evelyn made tea and sat at the cutting table and looked at the dress form in the corner, which held today a half-finished commission in a deep burgundy wool that would become an overcoat for a woman who had commissioned it for her 30th wedding anniversary trip to New York. She pinned the collar stand at the precise angle she'd marked from the fitting and stepped back and looked at it. It was right. Not because she'd gotten lucky, but because she'd measured it 3 times and trusted the measurement and cut accordingly. She picked up the iron. She pressed the seam flat. Outside the shop window, Chicago was doing what Chicago did in late March, making no promises, offering no guarantees, presenting itself on its own terms, and waiting to see who would stay. The street was wet from overnight rain, the sky carrying the flat gray of a day that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be spring yet. She worked through the afternoon. At 4:15, her phone showed a message from Damien. Meeting ran over, hour. She looked at the message, at the simple direct fact of it. The 60 seconds, becoming something that didn't need counting anymore because it had become a different kind of instinct. She typed back, "Soup's better the second day." 3 dots. Then, "I'll bring bread." She set the phone down and picked up the iron and pressed the next seam flat. And the shop was quiet around her, and the afternoon light came through the window at its familiar angle, and the work was there in her hands where it had always been, and she was exactly where she was, which was enough. Which had always been enough. She just hadn't known how to let it be, until now. Fade out.